Good evening. On the surface, it would seem a simple matter. Bolivia, the poorest nation in South America, very much needs financial and other aid from the United States if it is ever to prosper. The U.S. is ready and willing to provide that help now because a new civilian government is finally in charge, having replaced a corrupt, brutal military junta whose human rights record had kept U.S. aid frozen for 2 years. But there's a catch. In return, the U.S. wants Bolivia to eradicate its #1 industry, the growing, producing, and smuggling of cocaine, most of which ends up in the United States. It's part of a Reagan administration effort to curb drug trafficking at the source. But 4,000 miles south of here, at the source, in Bolivia, eliminating the cocaine industry is anything but simple, as we see in this documentary report by David Lomax of the BBC's Panorama program.
Bolivia stands at a crossroads, a nation rich in history, yet torn apart by political chaos and military power struggles. Coca, a once sacred leaf of the Andes, has become the heartbeat of a new global economy. The world's demand for white powder grows every single day. Bolivia in the 1980s was a country caught between generals, politicians, and money. Military coups came and went, governments collapsed overnight. Power was no longer decided at the ballot box. Behind closed doors, power was bought, not earned, and the line between state and criminal finance blurred. In that vacuum, Roberto Suárez Gómez, the cocaine godfather of Bolivia, and his enforcer, Klaus Barbie, an infamous Nazi war criminal, held all of the money and influence. Suárez would later inspire Mr. Sosa in Scarface, a rare moment where Hollywood barely even exaggerated reality. Roberto Suárez Gómez was born in 1918 into a wealthy ranching family in the Beni region of Bolivia. Here, coca was not a drug, it was a tradition, a spiritual leaf chewed for centuries by indigenous communities. But as the 20th century progressed, coca's alkaloid was refined into cocaine, the infamous drug, coveted in markets far from the Andes. Suárez studied economics and politics. He was a businessman before he became a trafficker, and his understanding of supply chains, international trade, and rural economies would later define his empire. In the 1960s and early 70s, the demand for cocaine began to rise dramatically, particularly in the United States. What was once a traditional crop had become a global commodity. Smugglers had existed for years, but Roberto saw an opportunity to industrialize production, not just traffic it. Suárez built what became known as La Corporación, Bolivia's cocaine empire. He didn't sell street drugs, he sold in bulk. He sold by the ton. His clients were powerful, most notably the Medellín Cartel, ran by the infamous drug lord Pablo Escobar. In the early 1980s, Suárez was supplying up to 80% of the cocaine entering Colombia. His wealth was measured not in bank accounts, but in aircraft, land, and influence. At his peak, Roberto Suárez Gómez was reportedly earning hundreds of millions of dollars per annum. But money alone wasn't enough. To protect his empire, Suárez needed political control. On the 17th of July 1980, Bolivia's fragile democracy collapsed. A violent military coup overthrew the government, installing General Luis Garcia Meza as the puppet president. This wasn't just a coup, it was later known as the Cocaine Coup, as drug money financed weapons, bought loyalty, and kept the regime alive. At the centre of this operation, the cocaine godfather himself, Roberto Suárez Gómez, not as president, but as a power broker operating behind the scenes in the shadows. The state protected traffickers, and the traffickers funded the state. Bolivia had briefly become a narco-state, and enforcing this new order was a man with a darker past than anyone realised. Klaus Barbie was not a myth, he was real and he was infamous. Known as the Butcher of Leon, Barbie was a Nazi SS officer responsible for torture, executions and war crimes during the Second World War. After the war, he escaped justice with the help of Western intelligence networks and then later fled to South America. Under the new alias Klaus Altman, he then settled in Bolivia. There, Barbie reinvented himself, not just as a soldier, but as a security expert. He trained military forces, he advised intelligence units, and he understood repression as an art. By the late 1970s, Barbie had aligned himself with Bolivia's military elites and with Roberto Suárez Gómez himself. Barbie later became the regime's enforcer, strategist, and link between European mercenaries and Bolivian power. Together, Suarez and Barbie helped stabilise the cocaine coup through violence, intimidation, and money. While Bolivia produced, Colombia distributed. The Medellín Cartel, led by the infamous Pablo Escobar, depended on Suarez's supply. Cocaine flooded the United States, in particular. Miami became the gateway. Violence escalated, money multiplied. This was the golden age of cocaine, and its consequences would shape decades of global crime policy. Bolivia, however, could not sustain the illusion forever. International pressure mounted. The regime collapsed, and eventually justice caught up. Roberto Suárez was arrested in 1988 and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he lived long enough to see his empire disappear. He died in 2000, largely forgotten outside of historical and criminal circles. Klaus Barbie, however, was later extradited to France in 1983. There, he finally was tried and convicted for his crimes against humanity. He died in prison in 1991. The story didn't end in courtrooms, it lived on in fiction. The character Alejandro Sosa in Scarface was not invented from nothing. He was inspired by the real-life Bolivian cocaine barons, most notably Roberto Suárez Gómez himself. Hollywood dramatised the excess, but in reality the case was already very extreme. Behind the suits, the mansions, and the power was a simple truth. Money ruled where institutions crumbled and frayed. Roberto Suárez Gómez, the cocaine godfather of Bolivia. Klaus Barbie, the Nazi war criminal who escaped justice for decades. Together, they controlled money, fear, and influence in a country pushed to the brink. Their story is not one of glamour, but of what happens when power goes unchecked and the men that filled the vacuums. History remembers them not as legends, but as warnings, as what can happen when power goes unchecked. That brings us to the end of today's episode. If you watched this far, I thank you, and I deeply do appreciate your time. This is going to be the first of many videos about infamous crime figures throughout history. The next video is going to be about the real life Franklin Saint from Snowfall, so that will for sure be an interesting one, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, okay, that's all I have to say at the end here. But yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe. Yeah, and if you enjoyed the videos, watch out for new ones in the future.